Good day. My name is Chris Garbers and I'm a data scientist at 71.4, a research consultancy based in Cape Town. So today we're going to talk through the different questions that might arise when you're looking to generate market intelligence on housing sectors in Africa. For instance, what institutions hold the data, what kind of data do they hold, and what can this data provide intelligence on? We're going to follow this journey using CAF's housing value chain framework. This framework breaks the housing production process down into its various components and also speaks to broader macro factors that offer context into the housing market environment. But before we start this journey, it is useful to review the different data sets that can provide housing market intelligence. Now, these data sets range from thick data such as survey data to big data such as administrative and transactional data. Transactional and administrative data sets typically fall within the big data universe because they often contain millions of rows of data. These data sets are updated on a daily basis and are great for delivering up-to-date insights on formal housing market activity. But unfortunately, they do not capture any informal activity. Survey data sets can be classified as thick data as they typically contain multiple different measurements. Now, these data sets are great for providing information on both formal and informal markets, but often can become outdated due to their collection costs. So, with this background in mind on the different data sets available to us, let's begin our journey. And we're going to begin it with data related to the contextual environment of housing markets. Now, this data offers general market intelligence on the economic environment, the operating environment, and the demand for housing in a specific area or country. Survey data is the best source for defining housing demand and is readily available. Most national statistical bureaus will have what they call a microdata portal or a microdata repository where raw survey data sits that is available to the public for download. The great thing about having access to the raw survey data is that you can slice and dice it based on your specific interests. So you could, for instance, identify nuclear family households and you can see what their current housing conditions are, like how many of them have piped water into their dwelling and what is the main construction material of their homes. These types of metrics can really give you a good idea of the size and housing conditions for a specific market segment. And sometimes you may wish to make cross-country comparisons using this survey data. But what you'll find is that because stats bureaus can have very different survey designs and questionnaires, cross-country comparisons can be quite difficult to make. But this is where the demographic and health surveys come into play. So these surveys can assist in this regard because they have a standard questionnaire that is administered for many countries around the world. These surveys are accessible to the public through the DHS website, and as with Stats Bureau's microdata portals, you can download the raw survey data. So the bottom 40 dashboard from CAF is an example of how you might use this data to do a cross-country comparison. So here, CAF and its partners developed a dashboard using the DHS's raw survey data that compares living conditions of households across 10 countries in Africa. Moving now on from demand, we turn to scoping the economic environment of a country. Now, at this point, you want to look at macroeconomic indicators as they relate to GDP growth, GDP per capita, employment, the inflation rate, and the exchange rate. So most of these indicators are available either from the World Bank, which has a World Development Indicators repository, or the National Statistics Bureau. Sometimes it's better to go as close to the original source of the data as opposed to an aggregator like the World Bank. So in such cases, you'd go to the National Stats Bureau's website and download their national accounts or statistical abstract publications. So these publications will provide many of the indicators that relate to the economy's performance as a whole. Measuring the operating environment of a housing market is much more challenging than measuring the economic environment or demand. Typically, you will need to use proxies related to administrative or regulatory burdens, and indicators that capture procedural burdens are commonly used. For example, you might be interested in measuring the number of administrative procedures that you have to complete in order to register your property. And you'd also want to know how long do these different procedures take and how much does each one cost. Knowing how these administrative burdens differ across the value chain could also be valuable. For example, how does it differ when you obtain a building permit versus registering a title deed for a property? But in essence, these types of indicators give you an idea about how difficult it is to do business in a country's housing market. In the absence of publicly available data sources for this information, you need to lean on qualitative methods such as interviews with developers and municipal officials. However, it is worthwhile to note that when you collect data in this way, it may not be representative of the market's experience as a whole. We're now turning to data sources that describe the 4 stages of the value chain, starting with land and infrastructure. To examine land and infrastructure conditions, you combine transactional, administrative, and survey datasets. Survey datasets will ask households various questions related to infrastructure. As mentioned earlier, these datasets are accessible through the microdata portals of national statistical bureaus or the DHS. Examples of infrastructure questions in household surveys include: what is your household's main source of water and electricity? What kind of sanitation facility do you have? Do you have garbage disposal, and who provides it? So you can use this information to describe, for example, how many households do not have adequate infrastructure according to whatever your definition of adequate infrastructure is. Survey data sets might also ask questions around what kind of proof of ownership do you have. For instance, do you have an actual registered title, or do you just have a letter from a relative that says you own this house? So you can supplement this survey information with data on land transactions to get an idea around the prevalence of formal registered home ownership. For example, you can compare the number of registered title deeds with the number of households and the number of dwellings. Together, this can provide an indication of the scale of home ownership and whether titling is a big issue. Market intelligence for housing and construction is sourced mostly from administrative data. The key indicators you look for here include the number of applications for building new houses, the number of new houses where construction has started, and the number of new houses that have actually been completed. In the United States, those metrics get released publicly and often move financial markets since they are a great indicator of real economic activity. US data on housing starts and completions is collected via surveying methods, which are quite expensive to conduct. This is not the case in many African countries, where electronic permitting systems have been deployed. With these e-permitting systems, the whole building application approval pipeline has been digitized, which means that the data is automatically collected as part of the different administrative procedures. For instance, as part of establishing a new development, a developer has to apply for a building permit for, let's say, 10 units. That number gets recorded in the system. And when it gets approved, it gets recorded in the system. And when an occupancy permit is issued, it also gets recorded in the system. So as a result of this digitized administrative process, a whole dataset is created. And although the purpose of the process was not to provide market intelligence, but rather to regulate market activity, it can provide a real and valuable indication of market activity and how many units were actually delivered. These datasets can then be aggregated to give you a view of activity on a national level or a city level. For instance, in Kenya, you could focus on Nairobi or Mombasa, or aggregate across cities to get a national view. But there are challenges to unlocking these insights, and at present, these systems are not being utilized to deliver much in the way of market intelligence. Some of the information is provided by the National Stats Bureau, but once again, it is provided in an aggregated manner. And as a result, you aren't able to really slice and dice this data as much as you'd want to. And even the stats bureaus don't get the raw data. They receive the summarized data from the local governments, which they in turn then aggregate further themselves. When looking for this data, a good starting point is the annual publications by the stats bureaus. For instance, most will publish an annual statistical abstract, and it is in this publication where you might see numbers published on house completions. However, in order to get the underlying raw data, you will need to work directly with the local government authorities that manage these e-permitting systems. The value of investment in housing is another key metric that is often not published. This metric is derived from gross fixed capital formation of residential dwellings, a subcomponent of aggregated gross fixed capital formation. Now, most of the time, only the aggregated gross fixed capital formation figure is available. So to obtain the subcomponent related to residential investment requires that you contact officials in the National Accounts Department at the Stats Bureau. When this is used together with the permitting data, you can actually see how much was invested in housing, how much was approved for construction, and then how much was actually built. More detailed housing investment data can also be collected from developers. As part of their project management, a developer will have a bill of quantities that records all the different materials that were used in constructing their units. So this data can tell you how much of an input, for instance labor and materials, was used to create a home. The challenge with this data is that, although it is extremely detailed, it is not representative of the market as a whole. It is only relevant for a particular development by a specific developer. So you will need to aggregate that data across developers and developments in order to get a representative view of the market. We now turn to the sales and rental link in the housing value chain. And for sales and rental information, transactions data and survey data are most useful. Survey data will give you an idea of the tenure status of households. You know, how many households own their dwelling, how many households rent their dwelling, and what kind of dwellings do they rent and own? Like, how many bedrooms do they have, and what materials are their homes made of? While this survey data can be sourced from the National Stats Bureaus or the DHS, transactions data related to sales and rental would be sourced from the Land Registry or Deeds Registry, where you can track transactions of homes taking place. The challenge with this data is that it is often not publicly disseminated. In South Africa, the data is collected, but you have to purchase it. There are companies who purchase and compile this data, and in turn, you can buy the data from them. The other useful data for this part of the value chain relates to housing finance, and data published by the central bank is useful here. As the supervisor of the financial system, central banks are responsible for financial stability, and in some countries they require the banks to submit quite detailed transactional data. The metrics made available by the central bank are most often published in their financial stability reports. For instance, most financial stability reports will publish data related to the stock of outstanding residential mortgages. Examples include the value of outstanding residential mortgages and the number of outstanding residential mortgages. Additional useful data would track the number of mortgages issued for residential purposes as well as the value of residential mortgages that have been issued. So not just the stock of residential mortgages, but also the flow. Through its role as supervisory authority, the central bank would once again be the key custodian of this data. In addition to these high-level metrics, you'd also want to get information on the financing terms associated with residential property transactions. For instance, what was the typical tenure of residential mortgages, and what was the typical interest rate and loan-to-value ratio for these mortgages? Now, unfortunately, this data is hardly ever collected by central banks. So, in order to access this data, you need to go to individual commercial banks' websites or talk to people at commercial banks directly. But as with data collected from developers, data from individual commercial banks may not be representative of market financing terms. For the maintenance and management link of the value chain, data is quite thin, and your best kind of estimates there would be to look at administrative accounts, again, at a local government level. In municipal revenue data, you could see how many households are paying property rates and taxes, and this can provide an indication of municipal management capability and revenue coming to government from managing residential areas. Another useful source for data related to the maintenance and management of housing are household surveys, specifically income and expenditure surveys, which asks households questions around how much they spend on maintaining their house. These income and expenditure surveys can also be used to calculate total household expenditure as a proxy for household income, and together with spending on maintenance and management, you can assess what proportion of household expenditure is dedicated to maintenance and management. And with that, we conclude our journey through the housing data ecosystem. We identified survey, administrative, and transactional data sets as core sources for housing market intelligence. Of these, administrative systems are probably the most underutilized source of housing market data. And going forward, efforts that aim to unlock the market intelligence stored in these systems should be a high priority for housing market practitioners.